Did you know that, in the Middle Ages, finding love was a quest fraught with peril, awkwardness, and often truly baffling decisions? What kinds of grand romantic gestures between the 5th and 15th centuries do you suppose would land a suitor in the deepest pits of the friend zone, or perhaps even worse, exile? Prepare to witness some truly questionable dating strategies from a bygone era. Number 10. The knight who wore his battle wounds like a corsage. Sir Kaelen of the misty moors had just returned from a skirmish, his arm still wrapped in bloodied linen, a festering gash on his thigh barely concealed by his chainmail. He swaggered into the great hall, spotting Lady Isolde by the fire, her embroidery shimmering in the flickering light. He had heard tales of her beauty, her wit, and her formidable dowry. Kaelen believed himself a paragon of chivalry, a true warrior whose scars told tales of courage and valor. In the rough and tumble world of medieval warfare, a man's ability to endure pain and survive grievous injuries was indeed a mark of his prowess. Chroniclers like Jean Froissart often lauded knights for their bravery on the battlefield, detailing their wounds with a certain grisly admiration. Perception was that these physical markers were badges of honor, proof of a man's worthiness to protect and provide. Kaelen decided his best approach was to display his recent injuries prominently. He approached Lady Isolde with a pained but triumphant grin, his left arm held stiffly, the bandage on his forearm a stark white against his grimy tunic. "My lady," he began, his voice a little strained, "I have just returned from the eastern marches. A savage skirmish it was, many foes fell, but not without leaving their mark." He gestured vaguely at his arm, then shifted his weight, wincing slightly as his thigh wound protested. He expected a gasp of admiration, perhaps a tender inquiry about his suffering. He anticipated a maiden swooning at the sheer audacity of his valor, at the sight of a knight who had faced death and lived to tell the tale, still bearing the fresh evidence of his ordeal. What Sir Kaelen failed to grasp was the subtle, yet profoundly important difference between battlefield admiration and romantic appeal. In a world where basic hygiene was a foreign concept to many and infections claimed lives with terrifying regularity, a fresh, poorly bandaged wound was not a symbol of romance. It was a biohazard. Medical knowledge of the era, as evinced by texts like the Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, was rudimentary at best. The concept of germ theory was centuries away. Wounds often festered, turned gangrenous, and smelled truly dreadful. The pus, the swelling, the faint, sickly sweet odor of decay, these were not the scents of a romantic rendezvous. They were the harbingers of fever, disfigurement, and often death. Lady Isolde, for her part, was not impressed. She was a woman of noble birth, accustomed to the finest silks and the freshest flowers. Her world, though constrained by the era's limitations, still valued cleanliness and a certain aesthetic appeal. The sight of Kaelen's blood-stained bandages and the faint, unsettling scent of his wounds caused her nose to crinkle almost imperceptibly. She had seen enough suffering and sickness in her own household among the serfs and even the occasional knight to understand the grim reality of such injuries. She did not see a brave warrior. She saw a potential carrier of disease, a man who might soon be bedridden, requiring constant care and a drain on resources. She saw a man whose injury, if it worsened, could leave him permanently crippled or worse, dead. Furthermore, medieval courtship, especially among the nobility, often followed the complex and highly stylized rules of courtly love, as detailed in works like Andreas Capellanus's Tractatus de Amore, The Art of Courtly Love. This idealized form of love emphasized polite manners, respectful admiration, and the adoration of a lady's beauty and virtue. It was about poetic declarations, chivalrous deeds performed for the lady's honor, and subtle gestures of devotion. It was not about displaying raw, unhygienic injuries. A true courtly lover was supposed to be clean, well-groomed, and presentable. Emphasis was on refinement, not on the grimy reality of war. Kaelen's approach also misjudged the practicalities of medieval life for a noblewoman. Marriage was often a political and economic alliance, and a potential husband's health and ability to produce heirs were paramount considerations. A knight with a constantly weeping wound was not just unappealing. He was a liability. He might not be able to defend his lands, he might be infertile, or he might simply die, leaving her widowed and vulnerable. The idea of linking her future, her family's fortunes, and her very survival to a walking medical emergency was not romantic in the slightest. His grand, self-congratulatory display also lacked humility, a virtue often praised in courtly literature. Rather than humbly requesting her favor or performing a deed for her, he presented his suffering as a demand for admiration. It was a crude, self-centered attempt to impress one that failed to acknowledge Isolde's own sensibilities or the expectations of their social class. He expected pity, not genuine affection. He aimed for awe, but evoked only distaste. So, as Sir Kaelen continued to elaborate on the gruesome details of his battle and the specific nature of his wound, Lady Isolde merely offered a cool, polite nod. She then gracefully excused herself, citing an urgent matter with her ladies-in-waiting. Kaelen, left alone in the hall with his throbbing arm and the lingering scent of infection, was perplexed. He truly believed he had presented his best self, a testament to his manliness and bravery. He just did not understand that in matters of the heart, sometimes the most heroic deeds were best left in the realm of stories, not brought to the hall still oozing and smelling faintly of medieval battlefield. His attempt, far from being a captivating display of valor, was simply a revolting spectacle, a master class in how not to win a lady's affection in an era where basic sanitation was a luxury and open wounds were a terrifying harbinger of doom. The stench alone would have been enough to send any sensible maiden fleeing in the opposite direction. Number 9. The minstrel who sang a dirge to woo. Gareth, a minstrel of middling talent, fancied himself a true poet. He had traveled from village to village, strumming his worn lute and singing ballads of heroes and tragic lovers. His voice, though not particularly strong, carried a certain melancholic quality that he believed would resonate deeply with the refined sensibilities of Lady Eleanor. Eleanor, daughter of Lord Reginald, was known for her love of music and her delicate nature. Gareth had heard tales of her appreciation for artistry, and he determined that a musical serenade would be his most potent weapon in his romantic arsenal. He had observed her from afar, noting her frequent visits to the castle's quiet garden, where she would sit by the fountain, often lost in thought. One crisp autumn evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of purple and gold, Gareth positioned himself beneath Lady Eleanor's window, his heart thrumming with a mix of anticipation and nerves. He took a deep breath, adjusted his lute, and began to play. He had chosen a piece, not a jaunty love song or a chivalrous epic, but a lament. It was a dirge, a sorrowful melody typically performed at funerals or to mourn lost loves and fallen heroes. The lyrics spoke of the brevity of life, the inevitability of decay, the gnawing pain of separation, and the cold embrace of the grave. It was a mournful, drawn-out ballad, filled with sighs and somber pronouncements, a true tear-jerker if one were at a wake. Gareth poured his entire soul into the performance, his voice wavering with what he believed was profound emotion. He envisioned Lady Eleanor, her eyes misting over, touched by the raw sorrow of his psalm, perhaps even believing he was suffering from some unrequited love, a suffering she might wish to alleviate. He believed this demonstration of deep feeling, this stark confrontation with mortality, would somehow stir her heart and make her see him as a man of great depth and sensitivity. He imagined her leaning out of her window, her hand pressed to her breast, overcome by the sheer artistry of his lament. Problem, of course, was that Gareth had fundamentally misunderstood the context and purpose of such a song. While medieval society was acutely aware of death and often expressed grief openly, a dirge was not a courtship tool. It was meant to elicit communal mourning, to honor the dead, or to express profound personal loss. It was not intended to spark romantic desire. In an era where life was already precarious, and illness, famine, and war were constant threats, people generally saw joy, hope, and distraction in their entertainment, especially from minstrels. Ballads of heroic deeds, of knights rescuing maidens, of enduring love, or even bawdy, humorous tunes were far more appropriate for social occasions, let alone a romantic overture. Sources like the Carmina Burana, a collection of medieval poems and dramatic texts, show a wide range of themes, from moralistic and satirical to amorous and convivial. While some songs are indeed melancholic, the vast majority of love songs speak of desire, beauty, the longing for union, and the joys of spring. They evoke feelings of hope and warmth, not the chill of the grave. Minstrels often played at feasts, celebrations, and gatherings, where their role was to uplift spirits, tell captivating stories, or provide light entertainment. To bring a funeral dirge to a romantic serenade was akin to bringing a eulogy to a first date. Lady Eleanor, startled from her peaceful contemplation by the somber wails emanating from below her window, at first thought there had been a death in the castle. Her brows furrowed in confusion, and then annoyance. Her day had been pleasant, her thoughts serene. She certainly did not need to be reminded of the fleeting nature of existence, or the cold clutches of death at this particular moment. The mournful notes jarred her senses, replacing her gentle calm with a vague sense of unease. She peered down, recognizing the familiar figure of Gareth, the castle minstrel. His face contorted in an expression of intense, almost painful sadness. He looked as if he were genuinely mourning, rather than trying to impress her. Her response was not the tender concern Gareth had anticipated, but a mix of perplexity and irritation. She simply closed her window, the soft thud echoing in the stillness of the evening. She certainly did not wish to encourage a man who seemed so preoccupied with sorrow. Her desire was for a suitor who brought joy, laughter, and perhaps a sense of security and stability to her life, not one who serenaded her with the musical equivalent of a weeping willow. The very idea of spending her days with someone who chose such a song for a romantic gesture filled her with a profound sense of weariness. Gareth, left alone beneath the now closed window, continued his lament for a few more verses, his voice fading into the night. He was utterly bewildered. He had bared his soul, shared what he considered the deepest emotions, and yet she had retreated. He had mistaken profound sorrow for romantic depth, believing that by demonstrating his capacity for sadness, he would somehow touch her heart. Instead, he had merely succeeded in making her feel uncomfortable and slightly alarmed. He had tried to woo her with a song of death, and in doing so, had metaphorically sealed the fate of his own romantic aspirations with Lady Eleanor. It was a hilariously tone-deaf performance, a serenade of sorrow that left him fittingly alone and dejected. Number 8. The Gift of a Mangy Hunting Hawk. Lord Reginald, a man of considerable wealth and even more considerable pride, decided that the conventional gifts of jewels or fine cloth were beneath his singular status when courting the fair Lady Beatrice. Beatrice, known for her sharp mind and her love for the outdoors, often accompanied her father on hawking expeditions. Reginald, seizing upon this interest, believed he had concocted a truly unique and impressive gesture. He would gift her a hawk, not just any hawk, but a magnificent gerfalcon, a bird considered the king of falcons, known for its speed and grace. Such a bird was a symbol of nobility, status, and skill in hunting, and a prized possession among the elite. He dispatched his falconer to acquire the finest specimen, but the falconer, perhaps through a misunderstanding or a stroke of ill luck, returned with a bird that was, to put it mildly, past its prime. This gyrfalcon was old, its feathers dull and ragged, showing signs of neglect. Eyes, instead of the piercing gaze of a predator, were watery and rheumy. Coughed occasionally, a dry, rattling sound that hinted at some lingering ailment. It also had a peculiar habit of plucking at its own feathers, a clear sign of stress and perhaps a parasitic infestation. Jesses, the leather straps around its legs were frayed and its talons were dull. In short, it was a mangy, ailing creature that looked more like a rejected barn owl than a majestic hunting companion. Reginald, blinded by his own grandiosity and his desire to impress, failed to inspect the bird properly. He saw only the species, the gyrfalcon, and the symbolic weight it carried. He imagined Lady Beatrice's delight, her awe at receiving such a rare and impressive creature, one that spoke of his own prowess as a lord and a hunter. He presented the bird to her, in a grand cage, wrapped in fine cloths, in the castle courtyard. "My lady," he boomed, gesturing dramatically at the caged bird, "I present to you a gyrfalcon of the purest blood, a symbol of your grace and beauty, and a testament to my esteem for you." He expected her to swoon, perhaps even to embrace him with gratitude. The gift, however, turned out to be a monumentally ill-conceived gesture. In medieval society, hunting birds were highly valued, not just for their practical use in procuring food, but as status symbols. A well-trained, healthy hawk was a sign of a lord's wealth, his leisure time, and his ability to maintain such costly animals. It required a skilled falconer, expensive food, and constant care. A healthy, beautiful bird reflected well on its owner. A sick, mangy bird, however, reflected poorly on the giver. It suggested a lack of discernment, a sloppiness in his affairs, or worse, an intentional slight. Lady Beatrice, far from being delighted, recoiled slightly as the faint, unpleasant odor emanating from the cage reached her. She was a woman who understood the nuances of animal husbandry. She had grown up around horses, hounds, and birds of prey. She knew what a healthy, magnificent gyrfalcon looked like. And this was most certainly not it. The bird's listlessness, its ragged appearance, and its wheezing cough were immediately apparent to her discerning eye. She could also see the small, dark specks moving among its feathers, a telltale sign of fleas or mites. Receiving such a gift was not just unappealing, it was a burden. A sick animal required immediate and dedicated care, a task that would fall to her household, consuming time, resources, and attention. It was not a grand gesture of affection. It was an imposition. It was a sign of a man who either did not care enough to ensure the quality of his gift, or who was so oblivious to the realities of animal care that he would present such a diseased creature. As chronicled by various medieval household books, the care of animals, especially prized hunting birds, was a serious matter, and the introduction of a sick animal into a healthy mews was a risk to all other birds. Beatrice offered a polite, strained smile. "My lord," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "it is a unique specimen. I shall ensure it receives the finest care." Her words were a veiled criticism, a polite way of saying that his magnificent gyrfalcon was clearly in need of extensive medical attention. She quietly instructed her own falconer to immediately isolate the bird, to prevent any potential spread of disease to her healthy mews, and to tend to its ailments. The falconer, a gruff but knowledgeable man, took one look at the bird and snorted in disdain. He knew a poor gift when he saw one. Lord Reginald, completely unaware of the subtle nuances of her reaction or the condition of his gift, beamed, believing his scheme had worked perfectly. He had tried to impress her with a symbol of status, but had instead shown himself to be either oblivious or uncaring. The mangy hawk, far from being a token of affection, became a symbol of his lack of judgment and his failure to understand the practicalities and aesthetics that mattered to Lady Beatrice. His grand gesture had devolved into a comical display of poor taste, a burden wrapped in the guise of a noble gift, ensuring that his suit was as likely to take flight as the ailing gyrfalcon he had presented. Number 7. The poet who penned an unintentionally insulting ode. Sir Percival, a knight of modest means but considerable literary ambition, believed himself a master of verse. He had spent many a long night by candlelight poring over the works of troubadours and perfecting his rhymes. His target for affection was Lady Genevieve, known for her sharp wit and her appreciation for eloquent speech. Percival decided that the most direct and potent way to win her heart was not through jousting or battle, but through the power of his words. He would compose a magnificent ode, a tribute to her beauty and virtue that would sweep her off her feet with its poetic grandeur. He worked tirelessly, crafting lines that he believed were both profound and deeply moving. He used elaborate metaphors, convoluted similes and archaic language, convinced that the more complex and flowery his verse, the more impressive it would be. He envisioned Lady Genevieve, upon hearing his masterpiece, being utterly captivated by his intellectual prowess and his heartfelt devotion. He would recite it to her in the castle garden, under the soft glow of a lantern, his voice imbued with dramatic passion. The poem, when finally unveiled, was indeed a masterpiece, but not in the way Percival intended. He had attempted to praise her beauty, but in his zeal for unique and striking imagery, he had inadvertently stumbled into territory that was at best confusing, and at worst downright offensive. For example, trying to describe her skin as radiant, he wrote a line comparing it to the bleached bones of saints shining with heavenly light. He meant to convey purity and luminescence, but the image of bones, particularly those of saints, was more evocative of death, relics, and the macabre than of fresh, vibrant skin. In a world where plague and disease were ever present, the association with bones was far from appealing. Another stanza attempted to praise her eyes, describing them as deep as a dungeon's abyss, where secrets untold forever lie. He aimed for mystery and depth, but the imagery of a dungeon, a place of imprisonment, suffering, and darkness, was hardly flattering. Conjured visions of torture and despair, not the sparkling depths of a beloved's gaze. Believed he was evoking a sense of captivating enigma, but instead he painted a picture of a grim, terrifying void. Furthermore, in his attempt to describe her voice as enchanting, he penned, "Your voice, a crow's call on a desolate moor, yet sweet as the bell tolling for a pauper's rest." While a crow's call could be seen as evocative of nature, it was generally considered harsh and ominous, a harbinger of ill tidings. And comparing it to a bell tolling for a pauper, while perhaps meant to imply solemnity or humble beauty, was more likely to evoke sadness, poverty, and a sense of bleakness. It was a chaotic mix of unsettling images that did not coalesce into anything remotely romantic. Medieval poets often drew inspiration from nature, mythology, and religious texts, but their imagery was usually chosen with care to evoke positive associations. The Roman de la Rose, a highly influential medieval allegorical poem, uses extensive natural imagery to describe love, beauty, and courtship, but it does so in a way that is harmonious and appealing. Percival's poem, however, was a mishmash of ill-chosen metaphors, each line striving for originality but landing firmly in the realm of the bizarre and the unintentionally insulting. Lady Genevieve, listening patiently to Percival's dramatic recitation, felt a growing sense of bewilderment and then a faint ripple of offense. She prided herself on her intelligence and her ability to discern true artistry from clumsy imitation. When he spoke of her skin like bleached bones, she felt a shiver of revulsion. When he compared her eyes to a dungeon's abyss, she raised a quizzical eyebrow, wondering if he thought her sinister. And the crow's call and pauper's bell left her utterly perplexed, unsure if he was praising her or subtly mocking her. She was not captivated. She was merely confused and slightly disturbed. Her wit, which Percival had hoped to impress, was instead turning against his ill-conceived verses. She suppressed a sigh as he concluded his dramatic performance, his face beaming with self-satisfaction. She offered a strained compliment about his unique choice of words and swiftly changed the subject to the weather, a topic far less fraught with potential insult. Percival, oblivious to her true reaction, believed he had made a profound impression. He thought his avant-garde poetry had simply been too advanced for her, too subtle for her immediate comprehension. He had tried to be a poetic genius, but had instead revealed himself to be a clumsy wordsmith, whose attempts at grand romantic declarations were riddled with inadvertently morbid and unflattering imagery. His ode, far from being a testament to his love, was a testament to his utter lack of understanding of both poetry and women, leaving Lady Genevieve to wonder if his intentions were pure or if he was simply trying to describe her as some kind of undead crypt dweller. It was a lyrical disaster, a love poem that inadvertently conveyed disgust. Number 6. The persistent stalker of the castle courtyard. Sir Alaric, a man of quiet demeanor and deeply misplaced romantic notions, had fallen desperately for Lady Rowena. Rowena was a vivacious young woman, often found bustling about the castle, overseeing household affairs or enjoying the company of her ladies. Alaric, however, was not one for direct conversation, for witty banter, or for any of the social graces typically employed in courtship. He believed that the sheer intensity of his unspoken admiration would eventually win her over. His strategy was simple, if deeply unsettling. Silent, unwavering observation. He would position himself in various locations around the castle where he knew Lady Rowena would pass. He would stand by a pillar in the great hall, linger by the well in the courtyard, or even station himself near the entrance to the garden. He would simply gaze at her, often for extended periods, his expression unreadable, his eyes following her every movement. He did not smile. He did not nod. He did not attempt to catch her eye in a friendly way. He just stared. He believed this unwavering gaze communicated the depth of his devotion, the singular focus of his affection. He thought his silent presence, his constant availability for her to observe him, observing her, would make her eventually curious, then intrigued, and finally enamored. In his mind, he was performing a romantic vigil, a silent testament to his unwavering love. He was like a devoted knight, ever watchful, ever present, a silent guardian. Probably imagined her noticing him, feeling a flutter in her heart at his constancy, and eventually approaching him to inquire about his profound, unspoken feelings. However, in the practical realities of medieval life, and indeed any period, persistent silence, staring from a distance, is not charming. It is unsettling. Personal space, though not defined by modern terms, still existed. People noticed when they were being watched. And when that watching was done without any social interaction, without a greeting or a clear purpose, it quickly moved from admiration to discomfort and then to outright alarm. For a woman, especially one of noble birth, such behavior could easily be interpreted as a threat to her safety or reputation. There are historical accounts and literary examples of obsessive admirers, but often their intensity was framed within a context of clear intent, however misguided. Alaric's approach, however, lacked any clear intent other than the silent, unnerving observation. It was not the silent devotion of a courtly lover who performs deeds for his lady. It was the silent fixation of someone whose intentions were ambiguous and potentially sinister. Lady Rowena was a busy woman with responsibilities. She did not have the leisure to decipher the nuances of a silent man's unblinking gaze. Lady Rowena began to notice him at first. She dismissed it as coincidence. Then, as she saw him day after day, always in her vicinity, always watching, she began to feel a prickle of unease. His silence was not enigmatic. It was creepy. His constancy was not devoted. It was intrusive. She found herself altering her routes, avoiding certain parts of the castle if she saw him there. She began to ask her ladies-in-waiting to accompany her when she went out, feeling safer in numbers. She even mentioned her discomfort to her father, who, being a practical man, considered having a quiet word with Alaric about his overly attentive behavior. Alaric, completely oblivious to the growing discomfort and mild alarm he was causing, continued his silent vigil. He mistook her avoidance for maidenly modesty, her discomfort for shyness. He thought her increasingly swift movements away from him were signs of her internal struggle, not her desire to simply escape his unnerving presence. He interpreted her polite, brisk nods as subtle encouragement rather than attempts to quickly disengage. His attempt to woo her through sheer, unadulterated staring failed utterly. He had managed to transform himself from a potential suitor into an object of mild fear and annoyance. He had tried to be the epitome of silent devotion, but had merely succeeded in becoming the castle's resident stalker, a man whose love language was so profoundly miscommunicated that it caused only unease and a desperate desire for distance. His romantic strategy was a masterclass in how to turn admiration into creepiness, ensuring that Lady Rowena would likely run in the opposite direction at the mere sight of his fixed, unblinking gaze. Number 5. The public display of melancholy for attention. Lord Bertram, a man of artistic temperament and a flair for the dramatic, found himself smitten with Lady Isabella. Isabella, however, was known for her cheerful disposition and her love of tournaments, feasts, and lively company. Bertram, perhaps having read too many chivalric romances where knights languished for their ladies, decided that the best way to capture Isabella's attention was to portray himself as a man consumed by a profound, unrequited love, a sorrow so deep it affected his very being. He would present himself as a figure of tragic romance, hoping to elicit her pity and concern, which he believed would blossom into affection. He began to cultivate a public persona of profound melancholy. He would sit alone at feasts, picking at his food with a mournful expression, occasionally sighing deeply enough to be heard by those around him. He would walk slowly through the castle corridors, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped. He spoke in hushed, somber tones, even when discussing mundane matters. He refused to participate in the usual revelry, claiming his heart was too heavy. He would gaze forlornly out of windows, his eyes seemingly fixed on some distant, sorrowful horizon. He even went so far as to refuse a particularly delicious venison pie, a sacrifice that truly signaled the depth of his manufactured despair. His performance was elaborate, almost theatrical. He wore darker clothes, affected a pale complexion, and even made sure to be seen in places where Lady Isabella was likely to be ensuring his sorrowful display would not go unnoticed. He expected her to approach him, her brow furrowed with concern, asking about the cause of his distress, offering comfort, perhaps even a tender hand. He imagined her being moved by his suffering, his singular devotion to an unnamed glorious love which he hoped she would eventually realize was for her. The problem, however, was that medieval society, while familiar with the concept of melancholy as a humor, a medical condition linked to an excess of black bile, generally viewed excessive, self-indulgent sadness with a degree of impatience. Feasts and social gatherings were meant for merriment, for strengthening bonds, and for enjoying life's fleeting pleasures. A person who constantly brought down the mood was considered a burden, not an object of romantic interest. While courtly love had elements of longing and suffering, this was typically private, expressed in poetry or deeds, not a public spectacle designed to elicit pity. The ideal knight was generally perceived as active, strong, and capable, not perpetually moping. Lady Isabella, for her part, was initially puzzled, then mildly irritated, and finally utterly bored by Lord Bertram's incessant melancholy. She was a woman who valued joy and vitality. She found his dramatic sighs and drooping posture tiresome. When she saw him pushing away perfectly good food, she did not see a tragic lover. She saw a man who was wasteful and perhaps even a bit ungrateful for the bounty provided. She also noticed that his sadness seemed to conveniently coincide with her presence. She was not moved to comfort him. Instead, she found herself avoiding him. Why would she seek the company of someone who seemed determined to wallow in self-pity? She preferred the boisterous knights who participated in tourneys, the witty scholars who debated philosophy, or even the practical squires who efficiently managed their duties. Bertram's cultivated gloom was a turn-off, a drain on the lively atmosphere she preferred. His deliberate attempts to appear suffering were transparent and, frankly, annoying. Her reaction was not the tender concern he had hoped for, but a polite yet firm distance. She simply found his entire act exhausting. When he once tried to catch her eye with a particularly mournful glance, she simply smiled brightly at someone else, turning her back to him. Bertram, baffled, continued his performance, convinced that she simply needed more time to recognize the depth of his devotion. His public display of melancholy, far from being a captivating romantic gesture, was merely a tedious and self-absorbed performance. He had tried to become a tragic hero for her, but had instead become the castle's resident killjoy, a man whose love language was perpetual sorrow. He failed to understand that while a little mystery might be intriguing, a constant performative sadness was simply off-putting. His attempt to woo her through manufactured misery ensured that Lady Isabella sought happiness elsewhere, far from the dramatic sighs and untouched venison pies of Lord Bertram. It was a strategy that not only failed but actively repelled, proving that not all attention is good attention, especially when it comes wrapped in a cloak of performative gloom. Number 4. The Serred Bath, and all its contents, proposal. Sir Gilbert, a man of simple tastes and a rather literal interpretation of intimacy, decided that the most direct way to show Lady Eleanor his affection was to invite her to share a bath. He had heard tales, perhaps from distant lands or misconstrued romantic epics, of lovers bathing together as a sign of their bond. In his mind, it was a gesture of profound trust and vulnerability, a way to shed social barriers and connect on a primal, uninhibited level. He imagined a romantic scene, bathed in candlelight, where they would share warm water and whispered secrets, leading to a deep, unbreakable connection. He approached Lady Eleanor in the castle's bustling courtyard, a place far too public for such a private proposition, and with an earnest, if misguided smile, he extended his invitation. "My lady," he said, his voice a little too loud, "I find myself weary from my travels and my bath is being prepared. Might I be so bold as to invite you to share its warmth and refresh yourselves together?" He gestured vaguely in the direction of the bathhouse, a look of hopeful expectation on his face. What Gilbert failed to grasp, or perhaps chose to ignore, were the stark realities of medieval bathing practices. While some nobility did indeed bathe, it was often a communal affair, or at least one done with little regard for modern concepts of hygiene or privacy. Bathtubs were large, often made of wood, and filled with water heated by stones. The water was not changed frequently. Often, the entire household would use the same bath water, sometimes in a hierarchical order, from the lord and lady down to the servants, meaning the water at the end was likely murky, lukewarm, and filled with the accumulated grime of many bodies. Herbal concoctions or scented oils might be added, but these were often more for masking odors than for true cleanliness. Moreover, personal hygiene was not a daily ritual for most medieval people. Bathing was infrequent, perhaps once a week, or even once a month, depending on rank, availability of water, and prevailing beliefs about health. According to some medieval medical texts, excessive bathing was even considered unhealthy, leading to weakness or susceptibility to illness. Clothes were often worn for long periods between washes. The concept of a fresh, private, and truly clean bath as a romantic setting was a fantasy from a different era. The reality was a shared tub, likely lukewarm and increasingly soiled with the very real possibility of skin irritations, body odor, and perhaps even the unwelcome presence of lice or fleas from prior users. Lady Eleanor, a woman of refinement and a keen understanding of social decorum, was utterly mortified by Gilbert's blatant and crude invitation. Her eyes widened, and a blush crept up her neck. Not only was the idea of a shared bath, given the actual state of medieval bathing, entirely unappealing, she imagined the grime, the lukewarm water, the general unsanitary conditions. But the very public nature of his proposal was a shocking breach of etiquette. Intimate invitations were not to be shouted across a courtyard. Furthermore, medieval courtship, especially among the nobility, was governed by strict social norms and expectations of propriety. Unchaperoned meetings, let alone shared baths, were utterly scandalous. Such an invitation, even if well-intentioned, could easily be interpreted as a proposition for illicit activity, jeopardizing a lady's reputation and honor. Her family's standing depended on her virtue, and any public suggestion of impropriety could have severe consequences, including tarnishing her marriage prospects. Eleanor, recovering her composure with remarkable speed, offered Gilbert a frosty glare. "Sir Gilbert," she said, her voice clipped and dangerously calm, "I thank you for your novel invitation. However, my lady's chamber requires my immediate attention." She then turned on her heel and swept away, leaving Gilbert standing alone and utterly bewildered in the courtyard. He truly could not comprehend why his seemingly heartfelt gesture had been so poorly received. He had tried to be intimate and bold, but had instead been uncouth and shockingly inappropriate. His attempt to forge a romantic connection to a shared bath was not just a social misstep. It was a testament to his profound misunderstanding of both medieval hygiene and medieval morality. He had tried to be a romantic pioneer, but had only succeeded in proposing a truly unappealing and scandalous scenario. Lady Eleanor, for her part, was left with a lingering sense of discomfort and the distinct impression that Sir Gilbert was perhaps not the most discerning of gentlemen. His romantic gesture had not only failed, but had also guaranteed that she would actively avoid any future encounters that might involve bathtubs, especially with him. It was a uniquely grim proposal, a splash of unintended social awkwardness. Number 3. The bragging about my many serfs and livestock approach. Lord Cuthbert of the Grey Hills was a man of considerable wealth, inherited from a long line of industrious ancestors. He believed that the most attractive quality a man could possess, especially in the eyes of a potential bride, was his material prosperity. He was courting Lady Rosamond, a woman known for her practical mind and her desire for stability. Cuthbert, misinterpreting her practicality as a singular focus on sheer accumulation, decided to impress her with a detailed accounting of his vast holdings. He cornered Lady Rosamond during a quiet moment in the solar, a private sitting room typically reserved for the women of the household. Rather than complimenting her wit or her beauty, or engaging in courtly conversation, he launched into a lengthy, dry monologue about his estates. "My lady," he began, leaning in conspiratorially, "my lands stretch from the Whispering Woods to the banks of the Silent River. On my northernmost manor I count no fewer than 300 serfs, each bound to my service, toiling diligently for my prosperity. They are strong, compliant folk, and their numbers only grow each year. My forests teem with game, and my fisheries yield an abundance of trout. Truly, my lady, my wealth is such that you would never want for anything." He then paused, a triumphant smile on his face, expecting Rosamond to be overwhelmed by the sheer scale of his prosperity. In medieval society, land and resources were indeed crucial. A lord's wealth determined his power, his ability to raise an army, and his capacity to provide for his family and retainers. Marriage was often a strategic alliance, and a prospective husband's material worth was a primary consideration for noble families. However, there was a significant difference between demonstrating one's prosperity through general reputation and social standing, and explicitly, crudely, and relentlessly enumerating one's possessions and the labor force bound to them. Nobility was not just about wealth. It was also about conduct, reputation, and the subtle art of social interaction. While a dowry and a lord's lands were discussed in marriage negotiations, the courtship itself was often expected to have an element of romance, however idealized, and certainly a veneer of polite conversation. To boast openly about the number of one's serfs, effectively treating them as property, was seen as crude and lacking in refinement. It reduced the potential union to a transactional arrangement, stripping it of any personal connection or affection. Chroniclers and moralists of the time often distinguished between honorable wealth and vulgar display. Lady Rosamond, who was indeed practical, was also a woman of refinement and intelligence. She listened to Cuthbert's monologue with growing disbelief and a slow, internal cringe. She did not hear a man expressing his affection. She heard a verbose accountant listing his assets. His relentless recitation of numbers and his casual talk of "my serfs," as if they were mere chattel, without any human context or consideration, struck her as utterly devoid of charm or sensitivity. She knew the importance of land and wealth, but she also valued dignity, wit, and a certain warmth in a potential partner. She was not impressed by his litany of livestock and forced labor. She was bored. She was also subtly offended. True gentlemen, she felt, would have demonstrated his wealth through his generosity, his comfortable living, and his good governance, not through a verbal inventory. His crude boasting revealed a man who was perhaps more interested in his possessions than in her as a person. It stripped the entire courtship of any pretense of romance or genuine connection, reducing it to a cold, hard calculation of resources. When he finished beaming, Lady Rosamond offered a very slight, polite nod. "My lord," she said, her voice devoid of warmth, "your holdings sound extensive. I trust you manage them with due diligence." She then gracefully made an excuse about needing to inspect the household accounts, a topic far more engaging than Cuthbert's livestock census. Cuthbert, completely oblivious to her polite dismissal and her thinly veiled disdain, interpreted her lack of effusive praise as a sign of her serious consideration, perhaps even a shrewd admiration for his business acumen. He truly believed he had presented his best case, that his financial standing alone would win her over. He had tried to be a powerful and prosperous suitor, but had instead revealed himself to be a boorish braggart whose attempts at romantic courtship were simply a tedious financial report. His strategy, far from being captivating, was simply boring and off-putting, ensuring that Lady Rosamond would likely seek a husband with a richer personality rather than just a richer landholdings. It was a hilarious miscalculation, a fiscal declaration disguised as a love confession. Number 2. The love token of a severed enemy's ear. Sir Gareth, a knight of valor and dubious judgment, had just returned from a particularly bloody border skirmish. He was deeply smitten with Lady Isolde, the spirited daughter of a neighboring lord. Gareth, having witnessed many a romantic tale where a knight brought a token of his bravery to his beloved, decided that the most potent and unforgettable gift he could offer Lady Isolde would be undeniable proof of his prowess in battle. He wanted to give her something that would demonstrate his ferocity, his fearlessness, and his capacity to protect her. So, after the battle, as his men were tallying the spoils and the fallen, Gareth made a rather personal acquisition. He found a particularly gruesome souvenir from a vanquished enemy, a severed ear. He carefully preserved it, or at least tried to, by wrapping it in a piece of oilskin. He believed this grisly trophy would be a testament to his strength and a clear signal that any who dared to harm Lady Isolde would face his wrath. He imagined her gasping, not in horror, but in awe, clutching the ear to her breast as a symbol of his unique devotion. He thought it would be a powerful, unforgettable romantic gesture, one that would distinguish him from all other suitors. In medieval warfare, trophies were indeed taken, sometimes even heads or other body parts, as proof of kills or as psychological warfare. However, these were typically displayed on battlefields or city gates to intimidate enemies, not presented to ladies in a refined setting. While tales of valor were admired, the direct presentation of a decaying, bloody body part as a love token was a grotesque misinterpretation of romantic gesture. Courtly love, as idealized in literature, emphasized chivalry, courtesy, and devotion to a lady's honor, not the exhibition of dismembered remains. Lady Isolde, upon seeing Gareth approach with a small, tightly wrapped parcel, initially thought he might be bringing her a piece of rare silk or a small jewel. Her curiosity quickly turned to abject horror as he dramatically unwrapped the oilskin, revealing the shriveled, discolored ear. The faint, sickly, sweet smell of decay, mingled with the scent of blood and dirt, wafted towards her. She stared at it, speechless, her face paling. Her reaction was not awe or admiration. It was profound revulsion and nausea. The sight of a human ear, severed and clearly decaying, was a deeply unsettling reminder of violence, death, and human suffering, not a testament to romantic love. She certainly did not want a decaying body part in her chamber, nor did she wish to contemplate the gruesome act that resulted in its acquisition. It was not a symbol of protection. It was a symbol of barbarity. To present such a thing to a lady of noble birth was not just a breach of etiquette. It was an act of extreme poor taste, demonstrating a shocking lack of sensitivity and an almost pathological misunderstanding of female sensibilities. It revealed Gareth as a man who was perhaps more suited to the battlefield than to the delicate dance of courtship. A healthy human mind does not associate love and romance with severed body parts. Isolde, managing to regain her voice, let out a small, choked gasp. "Sir Gareth," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "pray remove that thing from my sight. It is abominable." She then turned her back, pressing a hand to her mouth, trying to suppress the urge to vomit. She quickly retreated to her chambers, leaving Gareth standing alone, the gruesome love token still clutched in his hand. Gareth was utterly bewildered. He had presented what he believed was the ultimate proof of his devotion and prowess, and she had reacted with disgust. He truly believed he had outdone all other suitors with his unique and daring gift. He had tried to be the ultimate protector, but had instead revealed himself to be a man of questionable sanity and even more questionable taste. His attempt to woo her with a piece of a dead enemy ensured that Lady Isolde would remember him, certainly, but only as the knight who gave me a severed ear. It was a hilariously, horrifyingly bad romantic gesture, a true testament to the perils of taking medieval romance tropes too literally, and perhaps a sign that some things are best left on the battlefield. This misbegotten gift was so bad it likely ended his chances not just with Isolde, but with any sensible lady in the entire region. Number 1. The love potion gone horribly, hilariously wrong. Agnes, the village herbalist, fancied herself a master of the hidden arts, a purveyor of ancient wisdom and secret remedies. When young Thomas, a farmer's son, with a shy demeanor and a crushing infatuation with the miller's daughter, Alara approached her for help. Agnes saw an opportunity to prove her mystical prowess. Thomas, desperate and utterly lacking in confidence, believed a love potion was his only hope. He imagined Alara under the potion's spell, suddenly seeing him as the dashing, desirable man he knew he secretly was. Agnes, consulting her worn and dubious text, concocted a potion that she claimed would ignite the flames of passion. Her recipe included esoteric ingredients: powdered newt's tongue, likely just dried lizard, dried mandrake root, more likely a common weed, menstrual blood, a powerful, if unsanitary, traditional ingredient in some folk magic, and a generous portion of a local herb known to cause digestive upset. She also included a quantity of belladonna, a highly poisonous plant, albeit in what she thought was a small, effective dose. She called it the fire of desire, and assured Thomas that Alara would be unable to resist him after consuming it. Thomas, with trembling hands and a hopeful heart, managed to slip the potion into Alara's evening cider. He then positioned himself nervously near her, awaiting the magical transformation. He expected Alara to gaze at him with newfound adoration, to speak words of fervent love, and to fall into his arms. He anticipated a romantic awakening brought about by the subtle power of Agnes's arcane brew. However, the potion, far from igniting passion, unleashed a cascade of truly disastrous and unromantic effects. The herb for digestive upset worked with alarming efficiency, causing Alara to experience severe flatulence and abdominal cramps within minutes. She squirmed uncomfortably, her face flushing, not with passion, but with acute embarrassment. The belladonna, even in a small dose, began to take effect, causing her pupils to dilate wildly, giving her a bizarre, unfocused stare, and drying out her mouth, making her unable to speak clearly. It also caused her heart to race unpleasantly, making her feel anxious and unwell. Alara, instead of whispering sweet nothings, clutched her stomach, her face contorted in a grimace of pain. A series of unfortunate loud bodily noises escaped her, causing everyone in the vicinity to turn and stare. Her eyes, wide and unnaturally dark, seemed to look right through Thomas, or perhaps at some horrifying hallucination only she could see. Her breath became shallow and rapid. She began to feel dizzy and disoriented, her body betraying her in the most embarrassing way possible. Medieval medicine was a chaotic mix of empirical observation, superstition, and humoral theory. Love potions were common in folk magic, often relying on sympathetic magic or powerful, sometimes dangerous, herbs. However, their efficacy was always questionable, and their side effects often severe and unpredictable. The inclusion of potent laxatives or poisons was a common, if dangerous, element of such brews. Physicians of the era, such as those whose writings are preserved in the Liber de Simplici Medicina, knew of the effects of various plants, but precise dosages and understanding of complex drug interactions were non-existent. Thomas, watching Alara's bizarre and increasingly unwell reaction, felt his hopeful anticipation crumble into profound horror. This was not the passionate embrace he had envisioned. This was a medical emergency, mixed with a public humiliation. Alara, now clutching her head, stumbled and had to be helped away by her worried father, who was understandably furious at her sudden alarming illness. The love potion had not worked its magic. It had instead worked its maleficence, causing Alara to be violently ill, publicly embarrassed, and utterly unable to comprehend, let alone reciprocate, Thomas's affections. His attempt to shortcut courtship with a magical brew had backfired spectacularly, transforming his intended beloved into a gassy, hallucinating, unwell mess. Thomas was left staring at the empty space where Alara had been. His dreams of romance shattered, replaced by the lingering aroma of digestive distress and the terrifying realization that he had inadvertently poisoned the woman he admired. The love potion, far from being a catalyst for romance, had been a hilarious, albeit dangerous agent of social disaster, ensuring that Alara would remember Thomas not as her ardent suitor, but as the source of her most humiliating and uncomfortable evening. It was the ultimate medieval dating catastrophe, a toxic attempt at affection that truly exemplified how not to win a heart.